If you had walked into the CAV Electrics factory in Acton, West London, in the early 1960s, you would have seen an old man bent over an assembly line. It was just another face in the gray crowd of industrial Britain, a quiet elderly worker with rough hands and a thick, heavy accent. He ate his lunch alone. He tightened screws on electrical components for a few pounds a week. To the younger men on the line, he was nobody. Just a stateless immigrant lucky to have a job. They didn't know his name was Stanisław, and they certainly didn't know that 20 years earlier. The hands now stained with factory grease had held the lives of thousands of elite soldiers in their palms. They didn't know that this quiet old man had once stood in a room full of British generals and told the most powerful commanders in the world that they were marching to their doom. They didn't know he was a major general, a national hero of Poland, and the commander of the 1st Independent Parachute Brigade. When he died in 1967, his co-workers at the factory were stunned when a priest at his funeral began reading a list of military honors that seemed to belong to a different lifetime. They had been working alongside a ghost man who had been erased from history not by his enemies, but by his allies. This is not just a story about World War II combat. It is a story about the brutality of politics, the arrogance of power, and how a man who committed the unforgivable crime of being right was destroyed to protect the reputations of men who were wrong. This is the story of General Stanisław Sosabowski, the man who predicted the disaster of Operation Market Garden and paid for it with his life. To understand the tragedy of General Sosabowski, we must first understand the intoxicating atmosphere of September 1944. The Allies were drunk on victory. Following the breakout from Normandy, German forces appeared to be in total collapse. British and American armies were racing across France and Belgium, liberating cities sometimes without firing a shot. The German Wehrmacht, once the most terrifying military machine on earth, seemed broken. Fleeing in disarray toward the borders of the Reich, in the headquarters of the Allied High Command, caution had been replaced by a dangerous euphoria. The feeling was electric. The war could be over by Christmas. There was a sense that one final decisive blow would kick down the door to Germany and end the slaughter. Into this atmosphere stepped Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery, a man of immense ego and ambition, with a plan that matched the mood of the moment. Operation Market Garden. The plan was audacious, arguably reckless. It called for dropping 3 entire airborne divisions and British behind enemy lines in the Netherlands. These paratroopers would seize a series of bridges crossing the Rhine River, creating a carpet over which British tanks would roll straight into the industrial heart of Germany. It was the largest airborne operation in the history of warfare. It relied on speed, surprise, and the assumption that the German army was finished. But in the back of the briefing rooms, watching the pointers move across the large wall maps, was General Sosabowski. He was not swept up in the euphoria. He was a veteran who had seen his own country crushed by the Blitzkrieg in 1939. He knew the Germans better than the optimistic British intelligence officers did. He looked at the maps and he didn't see a victory parade. He saw a trap. While the British commanders saw a bold stroke of genius, Sosabowski saw logistics that didn't add up, drop zones that were too far away, and an enemy that was far from defeated. He was about to become the most unpopular man in the Allied command simply because he refused to close his eyes to reality. On September 12, 1944, just 5 days before the launch, the final coordinating conference was held. The room was packed with the aristocracy of the British military men like General Boy Browning and General Roy Urquhart. They exuded confidence. They were the victors, the liberators, and then there was Sosabowski. When the plan was presented, the cracks were obvious to a trained eye. The British 1st Airborne Division was tasked with capturing the bridge at Arnhem, the furthest and most crucial objective. But the plan called for them to land 7 miles away from the bridge. 7 miles to a civilian. 7 miles is a long walk. To a paratrooper carrying heavy gear in hostile territory without transport, 7 miles is a death sentence. It gives the enemy hours to react, to dig in, to block the roads. Furthermore, because of a shortage of transport aircraft, the drop would be spread over 3 days. This violated the cardinal rule of airborne warfare. Surprise. By the 2nd day, the Germans would know exactly what was happening. Sosabowski looked at the maps and saw a disaster in the making. He saw lightly armed men being dropped piecemeal into an area that British intelligence claimed was defending by old men and boys. but which his instincts told him would be defended by veterans. He tried to speak. In his deep, gravelly voice, heavy with the accent of a Polish exile, he asked the uncomfortable questions. He pointed out that the drops were too far, pointed out that the soil in the landing zones was too soft for gliders. But his concerns were dismissed with a wave of the hand. General Browning, elegant and poised, treated Sosabowski's objections as the nervousness of a foreigner who didn't understand the momentum of the Allied advance. When Sosabowski insisted that the Germans would fight, the room grew cold. He was ruining the mood. He was being difficult. The operation launched on September 17th. For the first few hours, it seemed the optimists were right. The skies filled with thousands of parachutes, a magnificent display of Allied power. But soon, the reality that Sosabowski had feared began to take hold. The radio sets didn't work. The jeeps didn't arrive. Most critically, the Germans were not old men and boys. In a catastrophic failure of Intelligence One that had been willfully ignored by Browning II, SS Panzer divisions were refitting in the exact area where the British were landing. Lightly armed paratroopers carrying rifles and Sten guns found themselves fighting Tiger tanks. Sosabowski's brigade was scheduled to drop on the third day to reinforce the British at Arnhem. But by the time they were ready to go, the weather turned. A fog blanketed the airfields in England. For days, Sosabowski sat on the tarmac, listening to the fragmentary reports of the disaster unfolding across the sea. The British paratroopers at Arnhem were being systematically slaughtered. They were surrounded, outgunned, and squeezed into a tiny pocket of hell. The carpet had rolled up. When the weather finally cleared on September 21st, the plan had changed. Arnhem was lost. Sosabowski was ordered to drop his men at Betrayal, on the south bank of the Rhine, to try and save the remnants of the British force trapped on the north bank. It was a suicide mission. As his men descended, they were met not by friendly faces, but by a wall of anti-aircraft fire. They landed under shelling. The situation on the ground was chaotic. The ferry that was supposed to take them across the river to help the British had been sunk. There were no boats. Sosabowski found himself commanding a brigade that had been decimated before it even fired a shot, staring across a wide, fast-flowing river at a dying British division. Desperate to follow orders, the Polish engineers scrounged up small rubber dinghies toys. Essentially, under the cover of darkness, they tried to paddle across the Rhine to reinforce the British perimeter. The current was vicious. German machine guns on the high ground raked the water. Flares turned the night into day, exposing the helpless men in their rubber boats. The river ran red with Polish blood. For days, Sosabowski's men fought with desperate courage. They held the ground at Betrayal, drawing German fire away from the trapped British, allowing the remnants of the 1st Airborne to escape. When the evacuation order finally came, it was the Poles who covered the withdrawal. They stood their ground while the British retreated. Without the Polish sacrifice at Betrayal, it is likely that no one from the British 1st Airborne would have escaped Arnhem alive. Let us pause to analyze the command failure here. Why did Browning and Montgomery ignore Sosabowski? It wasn't just arrogance. It was a fundamental disconnection from the reality of the battlefield. British command was suffering from victory disease. They believed their own propaganda. And he refused to be the one held responsible for the tactical absurdity of the plan. The decision to drop 7 miles from the bridge was the fatal flaw. Commanders justified it by saying the anti-aircraft defenses closer to the town were too dangerous for the planes. This reveals a terrifying calculus. The planners were more willing to risk the failure of the entire strategic objective than to risk losing transport aircraft. They prioritized the safety of the delivery system over the survival of the soldiers. Sosabowski saw this immediately. He understood that in airborne warfare, you drop on the objective or you don't drop at all. To drop 7 miles away is to turn a coup de main into a conventional infantry slog, minus the heavy weapons. Furthermore, the dismissal of the German panzer presence was not a simple mistake. It was a suppression of evidence. We know now that reconnaissance photos showed tanks in the area. Intelligence officers who tried to show these photos to Browning were told to be quiet. Why? Because the machine of Market Garden was already in motion. The political pressure to launch the operation was so immense that facts became inconvenient obstacles. Sosabowski was the only man in the room brave enough to voice the facts, and for that, he was treated as a pariah. There is a psychological dimension to this story that is often overlooked. We must consider the position of General Sosabowski. He was not just a subordinate officer, he was a guest. He was a Polish officer on British soil, commanding men who had lost their country. Dependent on the British government for their food, their weapons, and their legitimacy. When he stood up in that conference room, he wasn't just risking a reprimand. He was risking the standing of his entire nation in the eyes of the Allies. The British officers looked at him and saw a foreigner. They heard the thick accent. They saw the blunt, direct manner, which contrasted with the polite, understated style of the British upper class. And they categorized him as difficult. History often turns on these petty human biases. Had Sosabowski been a British aristocrat with an Eton education, his objections might have been termed prudent caution. But because he was a Pole, his realism was labeled defeatism. He was judged not on the validity of his tactical arguments, but on his failure to conform to the social etiquette of the British officer corps. This decision to ignore the outsider looked logical to the British clique, who trusted only their own kind. But in reality, it was a catastrophic failure of diversity in thinking. Groupthink had taken over Allied command. They were all reinforcing each other's delusions. Sosabowski was the necessary friction, the check on their hubris, and instead of listening, they silenced him. It is a chilling reminder that in war, culture and prejudice can be just as deadly as enemy fire. However, there is a darker layer to this story that goes beyond military incompetence or cultural bias. We must look at the geopolitics of expendability. Why was Sosabowski destroyed so completely after the battle? Why was the blame shifted so aggressively onto the Poles? The answer lies not in Arnhem but in Moscow. In late 1944, the political landscape of Europe was shifting tectonically. The Soviet Union was advancing into Eastern Europe. He viewed the Polish government in exile in London. The government Sosabowski served as a nuisance, an obstacle to his plan to install a communist puppet regime in Warsaw. Winston Churchill was in a bind. He needed to appease Stalin to keep the Grand Alliance together. He needed Stalin to commit to the final assault on Germany in the war against Japan. The Polish government in London was becoming a diplomatic embarrassment for the British. They were demanding sovereignty and borders that Stalin had no intention of granting. Into this delicate web walked Field Marshal Montgomery, looking for a scapegoat for his massive failure at Arnhem. Montgomery could not blame himself. His ego wouldn't allow it, and his status as a national hero made him untouchable. Couldn't blame the Americans, because the alliance was critical. Couldn't blame the British troops, because that would destroy morale. But the Poles. The Poles were politically expendable. By branding Sosabowski and his brigade as incompetent, by lying and saying they fought badly, Montgomery handed Churchill a golden ticket.
Oh.
It allowed the British to marginalize the Polish military leadership. It weakened the bargaining position of the Polish government, exile. If their elite troops were cowards or troublemakers, then surely their government didn't deserve a seat at the high table of victory. Montgomery wrote a secret letter to Field Marshal Alan Brooke, explicitly and falsely claiming the Poles showed no keenness to fight. This was a lie. He knew it was a lie. But it was a politically useful lie. It aligned Montgomery's need to cover his own failure with Churchill's need to sideline the troublesome Poles. Sosabowski wasn't just fired for being right. He was sacrificed on the altar of the Anglo-Soviet alliance. He was the easiest target, had no country to protect him, no powerful lobby in parliament. He was a man without a state, and therefore, he was the perfect vessel for the blame. This is the aspect of the war that history books rarely touch upon. The moment when a loyal ally is stabbed in the back, not for tactical necessity, but for diplomatic convenience. The psychological pressure on Sosabowski must have been unbearable, watching his men die for a cause that was already being sold out by the very commanders sending them to their deaths. Ending the consequences of this betrayal lasted for decades. In December 1944, Sosabowski was relieved of his command. He was humiliated, stripped of the brigade he had built and loved. When the war ended a few months later, he could not go home. Poland had fallen behind the Iron Curtain, just as he had feared. The communist regime in Warsaw stripped him of his Polish citizenship. The British government, eager to forget the embarrassment of Arnhem and the awkwardness of the Polish question, gave him no pension. So, the general went to work in the factory. For 20 years, he stood on that assembly line in Acton. He punched his card in the morning and punched it out at night. He watched the world move on. He watched movies like A Bridge Too Far turn the disaster he had predicted into a Hollywood epic. While he remained anonymous, he lived in a small rented house, caring for his blinded son, surrounded by the silence of a life unrewarded. It was until 2006, 62 years after the battle, that the Dutch government finally honored the Polish brigade with the Military Order of William, correcting the historical record. The British government took even longer, only acknowledging the injustice in recent years. Why does this story matter today? Because it forces us to confront the uncomfortable truth about how history is made. We like to believe that merit rises, that the truth eventually wins out, and that competence is rewarded. The story of Stanisław Sosabowski shatters that illusion. It shows us that truth can be suppressed for a lifetime if it is inconvenient to the powerful. Sosabowski's life is a testament to the price of integrity. He could have remained silent. He could have played the game, flattered Montgomery, and perhaps retired with a nice pension and a cottage in the country. But he chose to speak the truth to save his men. He failed to save them, but he saved his soul. When he died, he possessed nothing material, no estate, no riches, no power. But as he lay in that hospital bed in London, far from the land he fought for, he had the one thing that Field Marshal Montgomery, with all his medals and statues, never truly possessed regarding Arnhem: a clean conscience. The factory worker is gone, the general is gone, but the lesson remains. History is not just what is written by the victors, it is also what is hidden by them. And sometimes, the greatest heroes are the ones who are erased.